On a freezing winter morning, a young woman in a worn orange puffer jacket stood on the icy driveway, clutching her newborn daughter wrapped in a thin pink onesie and bonnet. Her in-laws had just thrown them out, calling her a worthless burden who had trapped their son. She had no money, no job, and nowhere to go. What they didn't know, what she didn't know, was that locked in a safety deposit box downtown sat documents that would change everything. A $95 million inheritance from a grandfather she'd never met. The cruel family who cast her into the cold had just made the most expensive mistake of their lives. But how long could a penniless mother and her fragile baby survive on the streets before she discovered the truth? And when she finally learned what was rightfully hers, would she find the strength to face the people who had shown her no mercy? The wind bit through Sarah's threadbare orange puffer jacket with the cruelty of 1,000 tiny knives, and she clutched her 3-week-old daughter Emma closer to her chest. The baby's small body wrapped in nothing but a thin pink onesie and a delicate pink bonnet that did almost nothing against the bitter February cold. Sarah was 24 years old, though she felt ancient in this moment. Standing on the circular driveway of the Whitmore estate, as her few possessions were hurled carelessly into the accumulating snow by a stone-faced butler who refused to meet her eyes. Behind her, the mansion loomed like a monument to wealth and cruelty, its windows glowing with warm golden light that seemed to mock the frozen wasteland where she now stood with her infant daughter. Victoria Whitmore, her mother-in-law, stood in the open doorway, her perfectly coiffed silver hair not moving despite the strengthening wind, her face a mask of cold disdain that had been polished to perfection over decades of looking down on those she deemed beneath her station. "You trapped my son," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the howl of the approaching storm with surgical precision. "Daniel was destined for greatness, for a marriage that would elevate this family, and you little opportunist, you got yourself pregnant and dragged him down to your level." Sarah wanted to scream that she had loved Daniel, that their baby had been wanted, that his death in that car accident 2 months ago had shattered her world, but her voice was trapped somewhere beneath the weight of grief and shock and the primal fear of a new mother with nowhere to go. Richard Whitmore appeared behind his wife, his expensive suit immaculate, his cold gray eyes assessing Sarah the way one might examine an insect before crushing it. "We owe you nothing," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, as though he were discussing a failed business transaction rather than throwing his son's widow and grandchild into a blizzard. "Daniel's life insurance goes to the estate. As per the prenuptial agreement you signed, the house was in our name, and frankly, we've been more than generous, allowing you to stay these past weeks." Sarah's hands trembled, whether from cold or rage or terror. She couldn't tell anymore. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just until the storm passes, just let us stay one more night. Emma is so small she'll freeze out here." Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "You should have thought of that before you latched onto my son like a parasite. Perhaps this will teach you that actions have consequences." The butler emerged one final time, dropping Sarah's battered duffel bag onto the snow-covered driveway, and without another word, the massive oak door of the Whitmore mansion swung shut with a finality that echoed in Sarah's chest like a death knell. The lock clicked into place, a small sound that severed her last connection to the life she'd briefly known, the life where she'd been loved, protected, and warm. Emma began to cry, a thin, reedy sound that cut through Sarah's shock like a blade, and she looked down at her daughter's tiny face, already reddening from the cold, and felt something crack open inside her. Not despair, but something harder, something that tasted like survival. The sky above had turned a bruised purple gray, and the first heavy snowflakes of what the weather reports had called a historic blizzard were beginning to fall, each one a frozen promise of the brutal night ahead. Sarah had $37 in her pocket, no car, no phone, no family, and no idea that sewn into the lining of the jacket she wore, hidden in a place she'd never thought to look, was a small brass key that would change everything. Sarah stumbled through the dark streets for what felt like hours, her arms aching from carrying Emma, until she saw it through the swirling snow, a beacon of fluorescent light spilling onto the sidewalk from a 24-hour laundromat called Spin Cycle. The air inside was thick with the smell of detergent and fabric softener, but it was warm, blessedly warm, and Sarah sank onto a plastic chair near the back, away from the windows. Emma was screaming now, a sound of hunger that made Sarah's breasts ache, and she dug through her duffel bag with shaking hands, finding the last bottle of formula, The powder measured out that morning in the Whitmore mansion kitchen. The water fountain in the corner provided lukewarm water that she mixed with desperate efficiency, testing the temperature on her wrist the way the hospital nurses had taught her just 3 weeks ago. As Emma drank with the single-minded focus of the very young, Sarah counted her money again, spreading the crumpled bills on her lap, $37, 3 tens, a 5, and 2 ones. She did the math in her head. Formula at the corner store was $12 a canister. Diapers were $15 for the cheapest pack. That left $10 for food for herself. But she'd need more formula by tomorrow. And the numbers didn't work. They would never work. "Honey, are you all right?" The voice was gentle, belonging to an elderly woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a soft bun, her face creased with wrinkles that came from a lifetime of smiling, though her eyes held a deep sadness. "I'm fine," Sarah lied, the automatic response of someone who'd learned that admitting you weren't fine was a luxury reserved for people with safety nets. The woman, who introduced herself as Grace Morrison, sat down beside her without asking permission. "I lost a daughter once," Grace said softly. "She was about your age, thought she could handle the world alone, too proud to ask for help until it was too late." She gently touched Emma's tiny hand. "There's a women's shelter about 6 blocks from here street. Catherine's, run by some nuns who believe in helping rather than judging. I volunteer there on Thursdays, and I can walk you there now if you'd like." Sarah wanted to refuse, wanted to cling to some shred of dignity, but Emma had finished her bottle, and the reality of spending the night in this laundromat with a newborn was too grim to contemplate. Street. Catherine's was a 3-story brick building that had once been a school, its hallways now lined with cots and temporary walls creating small pockets of privacy, and the nun at the front desk, Sister Margaret, explained the rules with a kindness that made Sarah want to weep. 3 nights maximum, no drugs or alcohol, lights out at 10, breakfast at 7, and they'd help her apply for emergency assistance in the morning. That night, lying on a narrow cot in a room shared with 5 other women and their children, Sarah held Emma against her chest and rocked her gently, whispering promises into the darkness, promises that she would keep her safe, that she would find a way, that they would survive this, even though she had no idea how any of those promises could possibly come true. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of street. Catherine's shelter, gray and weak, and Sarah woke with Emma pressed against her chest, the baby's small warmth, the only comfort in a world that had turned impossibly cold. After a breakfast of weak coffee and toast in the communal dining room, where the other women spoke in hushed voices about caseworkers and housing applications, and the bureaucratic maze that would determine their futures, Sarah returned to the small corner they'd been assigned and began the grim task of sorting through the belongings the Whitmores had thrown into the snow. Most of it was ruined, her clothes stiff with ice melt, photographs warped beyond recognition, but she went through each item methodically, driven by a desperate need to salvage something, anything, from the wreckage of her life. At the bottom of the duffel bag, she found Daniel's old jacket, a worn brown leather bomber that he'd treasured, telling her it had belonged to his mother's father, a man he'd never met but whose memory he seemed to carry like a talisman. The leather was cracked with age, the lining torn in several places, and as Sarah ran her hands over it, remembering the way Daniel used to wear it on autumn evenings, her fingers caught on something hard, sewn into the inner lining near the left pocket. She tore the stitching carefully, her heart beginning to beat faster for reasons she couldn't name, and pulled out a small brass key, tarnished with age, its head engraved with a number, 447. Attached to it with a piece of faded string was a paper tag, the kind banks used decades ago, its surface yellowed and brittle, the handwriting on it barely legible, written in a shaking hand that spoke of age or illness or desperate urgency. Sarah held it up to the weak light streaming through the window, squinting at the words, and felt the world tilt as she read. First National Bank, Box 447, Sarah Mitchell only. Mitchell was her maiden name, the name she'd carried for 24 years before becoming Sarah Whitmore in a small courthouse ceremony that Daniel's parents had refused to attend. She stared at the key, at the tag, her mind racing through possibilities and finding no answers that made sense. Daniel had never mentioned this, not once in their 2 years together, not during the pregnancy when they'd talked about their future and their families and all the dreams they'd had before his car went off that bridge on a clear October night. His mother's father, he'd said, but Daniel's mother was Victoria Whitmore, and her maiden name was Hartley, not Mitchell, which meant this key, this safety deposit box, was connected to Sarah's own family somehow. But that made no sense either, because Sarah's father had died when she was 6, her mother when she was 19, and she had no other family, no grandparents who'd left her secret inheritances, no mysterious benefactors waiting in the wings. She turned the key over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the solidity of brass and secrets, and a terrible suspicion began to form in her mind, a suspicion that Daniel had known something, had been trying to tell her something, had left her this key for a reason. Emma stirred in the shelter-provided bassinet, making the small mewling sounds that preceded a full-blown cry, and Sarah tucked the key and its tag carefully into the inner pocket of her orange jacket, the only pocket that still had a working zipper, her mind already racing ahead to the First National Bank, to box 447, to the mystery that Daniel had hidden in the lining of a dead man's jacket. Sarah left Emma with Grace at the shelter, the elderly woman having offered to watch the baby while Sarah pursued what she called important business, and she took 2 buses across town to the First National Bank, an imposing granite building that spoke of old money and older traditions, its marble floors so polished she could see her reflection, a young woman in a stained orange jacket with dark circles under her eyes who looked like she belonged anywhere but here. The receptionist directed her to the safe deposit department with barely concealed disdain, and Sarah found herself standing before a desk where a nameplate read, Mrs. Dorothy Hendricks, Safe Deposit Manager, the woman behind it perhaps 60 years old, with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that assessed Sarah with the cold efficiency of someone who'd spent decades separating the worthy from the unworthy. "I need to access a safety deposit box," Sarah said, placing the brass key on the polished mahogany desk between them. "Box 447, Mrs." Hendricks picked up the key with 2 fingers, as though it might be contaminated, and examined it with a frown. "Do you have your access card and 2 forms of identification?" she asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. Sarah's heart sank. "I have the key, and this tag, it has my name on it, Sarah Mitchell. That's my maiden name, Mrs." Hendricks glanced at the faded tag with the kind of skepticism usually reserved for counterfeit bills. "Miss, or is it Mrs.? Having a key doesn't establish ownership or access rights. Anyone could have found this key. For all I know, you picked it up off the street." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I didn't find it. My husband left it to me. It was sewn into his jacket. Then, you'll need to provide proof of that, along with 2 valid forms of government-issued identification, proof of current address, and documentation establishing your legal right to access the box. If you don't have the original access agreement, we'll need a court order." Sarah's hands began to tremble. "My driver's license was stolen from my purse 3 weeks ago, and I don't have a permanent address right now, Mrs." Hendricks's expression shifted from skepticism to something closer to contempt. "Then I'm afraid I cannot help you. Bank policy is very clear on this matter. We cannot allow access to safe deposit boxes without proper identification. There are laws about this, regulations. Please." Sarah heard herself say, hating the desperation in her voice, "I need to know what's in that box. It might be important. It might help me." "Mrs." Hendricks stood, signaling the conversation was over. "Then I suggest you obtain proper identification and return when you can provide the necessary documentation. There's a DMV office on 5th Street. Though without a permanent address, I'm not sure how you'll manage a replacement license." She paused, her gaze traveling over Sarah's disheveled appearance, the stained jacket, the exhaustion written in every line of her face. "And frankly, young lady, even if you do return with identification, I'll need substantial proof that you have legitimate access to this box. We have protocols to prevent fraud and theft, and walking in here looking like, well, like you do, with a story about a dead husband and a key sewn into a jacket, it doesn't inspire confidence." The dismissal was absolute, and Sarah found herself back on the cold marble floor, the brass key clutched in her fist, a small piece of metal that promised answers but delivered only another locked door she couldn't open. Sarah spent the afternoon at the public library, a grand old building with vaulted ceilings and the hushed atmosphere of a sanctuary, bouncing Emma gently in her arms while she waited for an available computer terminal. Ignoring the pointed looks from the librarian who clearly disapproved of babies in the research section. When a terminal finally opened, she typed Marcus Mitchell into the search engine with one hand while supporting Emma with the other, and the results that appeared made her breath catch in her throat. The first hit was an obituary from the city's main newspaper, dated 15 years ago. The photograph showing a man in his 70s with kind eyes and silver hair, and the headline read, Marcus Mitchell, 72, real estate developer and environmental advocate, dies unexpectedly. Sarah read the article with growing disbelief. Learning that Marcus Mitchell had been a successful real estate developer who'd made his fortune in commercial properties before dedicating the last decade of his life to environmental causes, fighting against corporate pollution and advocating for clean water initiatives, and that he died suddenly of what was described as a heart attack, survived by one daughter, Catherine Mitchell Hartley, and no other immediate family. Catherine Mitchell Hartley. Sarah's mind raced. Daniel's mother was Victoria Whitmore, born Victoria Hartley, which meant Catherine and Victoria were the same person, which meant Marcus Mitchell had been Daniel's grandfather, which meant he was connected to Sarah somehow. But how and why had her maiden name been on that safety deposit tag? She clicked through more search results, finding brief mentions of Mitchell's environmental work, his testimony before congressional committees about industrial contamination, his funding of independent water quality studies, and then, buried in the archives, a small article from 16 years ago about a lawsuit Mitchell had filed against Whitmore Industries for illegal dumping, a lawsuit that had been quietly settled out of court. Sarah's hands were shaking as she pulled Daniel's duffel bag onto her lap, the bag she'd been carrying with her everywhere because she had nowhere safe to leave it, and began searching through the pockets with new urgency, looking for anything she might have missed. Tucked into a small inner compartment she'd overlooked before, she found a business envelope, its edges worn soft from being handled repeatedly, and inside was a letter on expensive cream-colored stationery. The letterhead reading, Blackwell and Associates, Attorneys at Law, in elegant script. The letter was dated 3 months before Daniel's death, addressed to him at an apartment Sarah hadn't known he'd maintained, and it was brief and formal. Dear Mr. Whitmore, this letter serves as notification that our firm represents the estate of Marcus Mitchell, deceased, in matters pertaining to inheritance and asset distribution. Our records indicate you may have information relevant to locating the primary beneficiary of said estate. We request a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss matters concerning the Mitchell estate and the fulfillment of our client's final wishes. Please contact our office to schedule an appointment. Time is of the essence in this matter. Sincerely, Arthur Blackwell, Senior Partner. Sarah read the letter 3 times, each word opening new questions. Why had the lawyer been trying to reach Daniel, who was the primary beneficiary they were trying to locate? Why did the safety deposit tag have her maiden name on it when she'd never known Marcus Mitchell existed? And most urgently, why had Daniel never mentioned any of this? Not the letter, not the key, not his grandfather's death or estate or the lawyer searching for someone. Emma began to fuss, hungry again, and Sarah gathered her belongings with trembling hands. The letter and the key and the obituary printout forming a puzzle whose pieces didn't fit together in any way that made sense. But one thing was becoming terrifyingly clear. Daniel had known something, had been investigating something, and 3 months after receiving this letter, his car had gone off a bridge on a night with clear roads and perfect visibility. Sarah returned to street. Catherine's that evening with Emma and the weight of new mysteries pressing on her chest, only to find Grace waiting in the common room with news that would change everything, at least for the immediate future. I've been thinking, Grace said without preamble, her weathered hands clasped in her lap. I have a small apartment above my garage, nothing fancy, just one room with a bathroom and a hot plate. But it's warm and private, and I'd like you and Emma to stay there. No rent, just keep it clean and maybe help me with some grocery shopping when I need it. Sarah opened her mouth to refuse, pride and suspicion warring in her chest, because in her experience, nothing came without strings, without expectations, without prices that revealed themselves only after you'd already accepted. Grace seemed to read her thoughts, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. My daughter Emily would have been 32 this year. She said quietly. She got pregnant at 20. The father left. Her family, my late husband and I, we weren't as understanding as we should have been. We pushed when we should have listened. We judged when we should have helped. And one winter night, she decided she couldn't handle it anymore. Couldn't handle the baby and the judgment and the weight of it all. Grace's voice cracked slightly. They found her car in the river 3 days later. My grandbaby was 2 months old, died with her, and I've spent the last 12 years wishing I could go back and do it differently, be better. Be the mother she needed instead of the mother I thought I should be. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes as Grace reached across and touched her hand. I can't bring Emily back, but I can help you, and maybe that's what she'd want. Maybe that's how I make peace with what I didn't do then. The apartment above Grace's garage was small, perhaps 15 feet by 20, with slanted ceilings and a single window that looked out over a snow-covered garden. But it had a real bed, a tiny kitchenette with a working refrigerator, and most importantly, a door that locked from the inside. Over the next few days, Grace became Sarah's guide through the bureaucratic maze that governed the lives of people without resources, driving her to the DMV where they waited 3 hours to file for a replacement license. Though without a permanent address, the best Sarah could get was a state ID that would arrive in 6 to 8 weeks at Grace's address. Grace helped her apply for emergency welfare assistance, for WIC benefits that would provide formula and food for Emma, for Medicaid that would cover the baby's doctor visits, and through it all, she offered not just practical help, but a steady, non-judgmental presence that Sarah had never known she needed. They fell into a routine. Sarah would spend mornings applying for jobs online at the library, though her lack of recent work history and current address made callbacks rare, and afternoons helping Grace with household tasks, and in the evenings, they'd sit at Grace's kitchen table drinking tea while Emma slept in a bassinet Grace had retrieved from her attic. It was during these quiet evening hours that Sarah began, hesitantly at first and then with growing trust, to share pieces of her story, not everything. Not yet the key or the lawyer's letter or the growing suspicion that Daniel's death hadn't been an accident, but enough about the Whitmore's cruelty, about Daniel's love, about the loneliness of being 24 and widowed with a newborn and no one in the world who cared if she lived or died. Grace listened without interrupting, without offering platitudes or easy answers, and in her steady presence, Sarah began to remember what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than a problem, to be valued rather than dismissed, to have someone in her corner who asked nothing in return except the chance to help. The address on the letter led Sarah downtown to a part of the city she'd only ever seen from bus windows, where gleaming glass towers stretched toward the sky and people in expensive suits moved with the confident purposefulness of those who'd never had to count dollars or wonder where their next meal would come from. It took 3 buses to reach Blackwell and Associates, each transfer a small adventure with Emma's stroller, the cheap umbrella model she'd bought at a thrift store that had wheels prone to jamming and a frame that folded at inconvenient moments. The building itself was a monument to success, 40 stories of steel and tinted glass with a lobby of cream-colored marble and modern art that probably cost more than Sarah would earn in a lifetime. She felt immediately out of place, her orange puffer jacket garish against the muted elegance, her worn sneakers squeaking on the polished floor as she maneuvered the stroller toward the building directory, trying to ignore the security guard whose gaze followed her with obvious suspicion. Blackwell and Associates occupied the entire 38th floor, and as Sarah struggled to angle the stroller into the elevator, one wheel catching on the gap between floor and car, a young man in a crisp white shirt and blue tie appeared at her elbow. "Here, let me help," he said, lifting the front of the stroller with easy strength and guiding it smoothly into the elevator. He was perhaps 30, with sandy brown hair and kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and he pressed the button for 38 before Sarah could reach it. "Blackwell and Associates?" he asked, and when Sarah nodded, he smiled. "I work there. I'm James Chen, paralegal. You look like you're on a mission." Sarah hesitated, then decided honesty was her only option. "I'm looking for Arthur Blackwell. He sent my husband a letter about an estate matter. I need to speak with him." The smile faded from James's face, replaced by something that looked like genuine sadness. "I'm sorry," he said quietly as the elevator began its smooth ascent. "Mr. Blackwell passed away 6 months ago. It was very sudden, a heart attack in his office. He was only 58. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. 6 months ago, she repeated, her voice hollow. "What week? Do you remember what week?" James looked at her strangely. "The second week of October. I remember because it was right before the quarterly reports were due. Why does that matter?" Sarah's hands tightened on the stroller handle until her knuckles went white. The second week of October, the same week Daniel's car had gone off that bridge, the same week her entire life had shattered. 2 men connected by a letter about an estate, both dead within days of each other. And the coincidence was too perfect, too convenient, too impossible to be random chance. "Are you all right?" James asked, as the elevator doors opened onto a reception area of understated luxury. You look like you've seen a ghost. Sarah forced herself to breathe, to think, to push down the panic rising in her throat. The letter, Mr. Blackwell sent was dated 3 months before he died. He was trying to reach my husband about a Marcus Mitchell estate. Do you know anything about that case? James's expression shifted from concern to something more guarded, more professional. I worked on some of Mr. Blackwell's cases, but estate matters are confidential. I can't discuss them without proper authorization, but if you come to my office, maybe we can figure out what information I can legally share. At the very least, I can tell you who took over Mr. Blackwell's active cases after his death. He led her past the receptionist with a friendly nod and down a hallway lined with closed doors bearing nameplates of senior partners, to a small office barely bigger than a closet, its walls lined with law books and filing cabinets. And as Sarah settled Emma's stroller in the corner, she realized with a cold certainty that she'd just found the first person who might actually be able to help her understand what Daniel and Arthur Blackwell had died knowing. That night, after Emma was finally asleep in the small apartment above Grace's garage, Sarah pulled out Daniel's laptop from the duffel bag, the silver MacBook he'd used for his work as a junior analyst at a financial firm. She'd avoided opening it since his death, afraid of the memories, but now she powered it on with trembling hands, James's business card sitting on the table beside her with his cell number written on the back. The desktop loaded, showing a photo of her and Daniel from their wedding day, and Sarah forced herself to focus, looking past the familiar folders to something she'd never noticed before. A folder labeled simply Research, tucked in the corner. She clicked it, and immediately a password prompt appeared. The file was encrypted, protected by security she had no way of bypassing. She stared at the blinking cursor before picking up her phone and dialing James's number. It was 9 p.m., late to be calling someone she'd just met, but something told her this couldn't wait. James Chen, he answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. It's Sarah. From today I found encrypted files on my husband's laptop, and I think they might be connected to the Mitchell estate. There was a pause, then James said, "Send me a screenshot to this secure email." And Sarah, "Don't open this with anyone else watching. If what I suspect is true, this could be dangerous." The word dangerous hung in the air between them, confirming fears Sarah had been trying to suppress. He arrived 40 minutes later, carrying a laptop bag, and Grace let him in without questions, though her sharp eyes assessed him carefully. James sat at the small table, his fingers flying over Daniel's keyboard with practiced efficiency, running programs and entering commands, and finally, after 20 minutes, the encrypted folder opened, revealing dozens of subfolders organized by date. "Your husband was thorough," James said quietly, clicking through the files. "This is months of research. Look at this." Sarah leaned over his shoulder as he opened a folder labeled Land Acquisitions, 2008 to 2010, and found herself staring at scanned property deeds, purchase agreements, and title transfers, all involving Whitmore Industries and parcels of land that had once belonged to Marcus Mitchell. Daniel had created a spreadsheet tracking every property Mitchell had owned, and beside each one, notes about what had happened after his death, how his daughter Catherine had inherited everything, how she'd sold it all to Whitmore Industries within 6 months of her father's funeral, properties that Mitchell had spent years trying to protect from development. Another folder, labeled Environmental Reports, contained leaked documents from the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, inspection reports marked confidential, showing dangerous levels of contamination at sites where Whitmore Industries had disposed of industrial waste, sites that had once been Mitchell's land. Daniel was building a case, James said, his voice tight with excitement and fear. He was documenting that the Whitmores bought contaminated land from his mother, land that Marcus Mitchell had been trying to preserve, and then they covered up the contamination, falsified cleanup reports, and sold the properties to unsuspecting developers. Sarah felt cold spreading through her chest. He was investigating his own family's company. Why would he do that? James opened one final folder, this one labeled simply For Sarah, and inside was a single document. A letter Daniel had written but never sent, and the first line made Sarah's heart stop. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me. And you need to know the truth about your grandfather. Marcus Mitchell wasn't just my grandfather. He was yours too. My mother and your mother were half-sisters, which means we were cousins before we were husband and wife. which means the safety deposit box and everything in it was always meant for you. The knock came 3 days later, sharp and authoritative, the kind of knock that demanded rather than requested, and Sarah was upstairs in the garage apartment feeding Emma when she heard Grace's voice through the thin walls, calm but firm, saying, "I don't know what you're talking about." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the second voice, Victoria Whitmore's cultured tones made harsh by barely contained fury. "Demanding to speak with the girl who's been squatting in your garage." Sarah quickly laid Emma in her bassinet and moved to the small window, looking down to see a police cruiser parked in Grace's driveway, 2 officers standing uncomfortably behind Victoria and Richard Whitmore, who stood on Grace's front porch like visiting dignitaries slumming in a bad neighborhood. Victoria was dressed in an elegant black coat that probably cost more than Grace's car, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the cold wind, while Richard stood with his hands in the pockets of his cashmere overcoat, his expression one of practiced patience, the look of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted simply by waiting for lesser people to realize resistance was futile. "We have reason to believe," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air, "that Sarah Callahan, formerly Whitmore, has stolen property belonging to our son's estate, specifically a laptop computer and various personal documents that were removed from our home without permission." Grace's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "Sarah was thrown out of your home with nothing but the clothes on her back and a newborn baby. Any belongings she has were what you threw into the snow that night. Throwing someone's possessions at them isn't theft, it's cruelty." One of the officers, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, if there's a dispute about property, this is really a civil matter, not a criminal one." Victoria turned to him with the kind of look that made junior officers remember their place. "That laptop contains proprietary business information, trade secrets. Accessing it without authorization is corporate espionage, which I believe is very much a criminal matter. Now, we can do this the easy way, or we can get a warrant and tear this entire property apart, looking for stolen goods." Sarah heard Grace's sharp intake of breath, but when the older woman spoke, her voice remained steady. "Then I suggest you get a warrant, because you're not setting foot in my home or on my property without one. I know my rights, and I know harassment when I see it." Richard spoke for the first time, his voice smooth and reasonable, the voice of a man negotiating a business deal. "Grace, is it? There's no need for this to become unpleasant. We simply want what belongs to our family. Surely you can understand that. We're grieving parents trying to preserve our son's memory. Grieving parents." Grace repeated, and there was something dangerous in her tone now. "Don't throw their son's widow and grandchild into a blizzard. Grieving parents don't show up with police to intimidate and threaten. Now get off my property before I call my lawyer." There was a long silence, and Sarah watched as Victoria and Richard exchanged a look, some wordless communication passing between them. The officers were already backing toward their cruiser, clearly wanting no part of what was obviously a family dispute dressed up as a legal matter. Victoria took a step back, but not before leaning close to Grace and saying, loud enough for Sarah to hear through the window, "Tell that girl she has no idea what she's meddling with. Some secrets should stay buried, and people who dig them up tend to have accidents, just like our poor Daniel." Then they were gone, the cruiser pulling away, leaving Grace standing on her porch with her arms crossed, and Sarah standing at the window with her heart pounding and the terrible certainty that Daniel's car going off that bridge had been no accident at all. The replacement ID arrived 6 weeks after Sarah had filed for it. 6 weeks of living in Grace's garage apartment and jumping at every unexpected sound. 6 weeks of hiding Daniel's laptop in a loose floorboard beneath Emma's bassinet. 6 weeks of watching the street for black SUVs and wondering if every stranger who looked at her twice was working for the Whitmores. The plain envelope from the DMV felt like salvation when Grace brought it up from the mailbox, and Sarah stared at the laminated card with her photo, her name, her temporary salvation printed in official letters that no bank manager could dismiss. The next morning, with Emma bundled against the February cold and James meeting her at the bank for moral support, Sarah walked back into First National with her head high and her hands only slightly trembling. "Mrs. Hendricks looked up from her desk with the same expression of pinched disapproval, but when Sarah placed the ID on the polished mahogany, along with Emma's birth certificate as a second form of identification and a notarized letter from Grace confirming her address, the bank manager's face shifted from disdain to something closer to grudging acceptance. "I'll need to verify these," she said, taking an unnecessarily long time examining each document, but eventually, with a sigh that suggested Sarah was imposing on her valuable time, she stood and retrieved a set of keys from a locked drawer. The vault was a room of steel and silence, walls lined with small metal doors, each one hiding its owner's secrets, and Mrs. Hendricks led Sarah to box 447, inserted her master key along with Sarah's brass key, and with a metallic click, the small door swung open. Inside was a long metal box, and Mrs. Hendricks carried it to a private viewing room, setting it on a table before leaving with obvious reluctance, as though she suspected Sarah might somehow contaminate the space. Sarah's hands shook as she lifted the lid, and what she saw inside made the world tilt. On top was a letter-sized envelope, cream-colored and expensive, with her name written in shaking handwriting. "My granddaughter Sarah, if you're reading this, they've already tried to silence me." Beneath it, organized with meticulous care, were documents that represented a fortune. Stock certificates for blue-chip companies, dozens of them, their values written in neat columns on an attached spreadsheet totaling more than $40 million. Property deeds for parcels of land across Montana and Wyoming. 18 separate properties ranging from small residential lots to hundreds of acres of pristine wilderness, their assessed values listed on another spreadsheet totaling another $30 million. There were bonds, treasury notes, certificates of deposit, and at the very bottom, 2 items that made Sarah's breath catch. A USB drive with the word insurance written on a small label in that same shaking hand, and a legal document, a last will and testament of Marcus Mitchell, dated one day before his death 15 years ago. Sarah opened the will with trembling fingers, James reading over her shoulder, and there it was in clear legal language. "I, Marcus Mitchell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my entire estate, including all properties, financial assets, stocks, bonds, and personal effects, to my granddaughter, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, daughter of my beloved son, Thomas Mitchell, who died too young, and I explicitly exclude my daughter, Catherine Mitchell Hartley, from any inheritance, as she has chosen wealth over conscience, and has aligned herself with those who would destroy everything I've worked to protect." Sarah looked up at James, her mind reeling. $95 million. James whispered, having done the mental math. "You're the sole heir to a $95 million estate, and the Whitmores know it. That's why they want Daniel's laptop. That's why they threw you out with nothing. They've been trying to keep you from ever finding this." Sarah opened the letter, addressed to her with hands that had gone numb, the cream-colored paper crackling softly in the silence of the private viewing room, and Marcus Mitchell's words, written in a hand that grew shakier as the paragraphs progressed, reached across 15 years to tell a story of corruption, betrayal, and a grandfather's desperate attempt to protect a granddaughter he'd never met. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "I wish we could have met under better circumstances. I wish I could have known you as a child, watched you grow, been the grandfather you deserved, but your father, my son Thomas, made choices that led him down dark paths, and when he died in that accident when you were 6, your mother understandably wanted nothing to do with my family or the Mitchell name. I respected her wishes, but I never stopped watching over you from a distance, never stopped hoping that one day I might be able to give you something more than money, something more than property. I wanted to give you the truth." The letter went on to explain what Sarah had already begun to piece together from Daniel's research, that Marcus Mitchell had spent 40 years building a real estate empire, buying land, developing it responsibly, and making more money than he'd ever dreamed possible. But in his 60s, he'd begun to notice troubling patterns in the industry, companies buying up land cheap, land that seemed perfect for development, until you looked closer and found the contamination, the decades of illegal dumping, the toxic waste buried where no one would think to look. "I started investigating," Mitchell wrote, his handwriting growing more agitated, "and what I found made me sick to my soul. Whitmore Industries, the company my daughter Catherine married into when she wed James Hartley 25 years ago. They were the worst of them all. They had a system, a carefully orchestrated scheme where they'd use shell companies, corporations with innocuous names registered in Delaware or Nevada, to buy up land they'd already contaminated through their manufacturing operations. Then they'd hide the pollution, falsify cleanup reports, bribe inspectors, and sell the properties to unsuspecting developers who'd build homes and schools and hospitals on poisoned ground." Mitchell detailed how he'd spent 3 years gathering evidence, hiring private investigators, collecting soil samples, documenting the shell company connections, and finally, when he had enough to destroy Whitmore Industries completely, he'd gone to his daughter Catherine, believing she'd do the right thing, believing she'd help him expose her husband's family. She chose them, the letter continued, the words written with such force they'd nearly torn through the paper. She chose their wealth, their status, their lies over the truth, over me, over the thousands of people who'd been poisoned by Whitmore Industries' greed. She told me I was a foolish old man, that I didn't understand how business worked in the real world. And when I told her I was taking my evidence to the federal investigators, she begged me not to, said it would destroy her marriage, destroy her life, but I couldn't be silent. Not when children were getting sick, not when entire communities were drinking contaminated water. The final paragraphs were written in a hand so shaky they were barely legible. Dated the day before Marcus Mitchell's death. They know I'm meeting with the FBI tomorrow. Someone leaked it, I don't know who, but I've received threats. My lawyer, Arthur, has received threats. I'm leaving this letter and all my evidence in the safety deposit box, and I'm leaving everything to you, Sarah, because you're innocent in this. You're the only one in this family who hasn't been corrupted by Whitmore money. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. And they've already tried to silence me. But you can finish what I started. You can make them pay for what they've done. Don't trust the local police. Don't trust anyone connected to the Whitmores. They have people everywhere. Go straight to the federal authorities. And Sarah, please know that even though we never met, I loved you, and I'm so sorry for the burden I'm placing on your shoulders. James spread the documents across the small table in the viewing room, his paralegal training taking over as he organized them into categories, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency, while Sarah sat in stunned silence, Marcus Mitchell's letter clutched against her chest like a shield. Let's break this down, James said, his voice steady and professional, though Sarah could see the excitement in his eyes, the thrill of a man who'd stumbled into the kind of case lawyers dream about. The stock certificates total approximately $42 million at current market values. The bonds and treasury notes add another $8 million. There's $3 million in cash deposits across various accounts, and then there's the real estate. He pulled out a detailed map he'd printed from the property records database, marking each of Mitchell's parcels with a red X, and as the pattern emerged, Sarah felt her breath catch, because the properties weren't random, they formed a chain, a deliberate barrier surrounding a massive tract of undeveloped land in the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. This is the key, James said, tapping the map. Your grandfather owned 18 properties totaling about 900 acres, worth maybe $42 million if developed, but their real value isn't in what they are, it's in what they block. See this area in the middle, the land surrounded by Mitchell's properties. That's 12,000 acres of pristine wilderness, perfect for development, with access to water, power, highways, everything a developer could want, and it's owned by Whitmore Industries. They bought it 20 years ago for pennies on the dollar, and they've been planning what they call the Bitterroot Summit development. A massive project, luxury homes, golf courses, resort facilities, a development that would be worth billions if they could ever access it. Sarah stared at the map, understanding dawning. But they can't access it because my grandfather's properties block all the roads in. Exactly, James said. Montana law is very specific about landlocked properties and access rights. Without legal easements through your land, Whitmore Industries can't develop theirs. They've been trying to buy these parcels for 15 years. They offered Mitchell millions. Then after he died, they went to his daughter Catherine, and she sold them everything except she couldn't sell what she didn't inherit. Couldn't sell what Mitchell left to you. He pulled out another document, a development proposal from Whitmore Industries dated 6 months ago, showing projected revenues of $3 billion over 10 years for the Bitterroot Summit project, contingent on securing access rights through the Mitchell parcels. Daniel found this, James said quietly. I remember now. He came to see my Uncle Arthur about 3 months before they both died. He'd been going through his mother's old papers, looking for something. He wouldn't tell me what, and he found the original will, found out about you, found out his mother had lied for 15 years about the inheritance, and he was trying to reach you, trying to tell you about the $95 million that should have been yours all along. But more than that, he'd figured out why the Whitmores were so desperate, why they'd covered up his grandfather's murder. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes as the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. "The Bitterroot Summit development is failing," she whispered. "They've already invested hundreds of millions, and if they can't access the land, if they can't complete the project, the company goes bankrupt." James nodded grimly. According to the financial records Daniel compiled, Whitmore Industries leveraged everything on this development. They borrowed against all their other assets, promised investors returns that depended entirely on Bitterroot Summit succeeding, and without those access roads through your land, the entire empire collapses. That's why they killed Marcus Mitchell the day before he could expose them. That's why they've spent 15 years making sure you never found out about your inheritance. And that's why, when Daniel discovered the truth and tried to reach Arthur Blackwell, they killed them both. Sarah first noticed the black SUV on a Tuesday morning, parked 3 houses down from Grace's property with its engine running and windows tinted so dark she couldn't see who sat inside. And she might have dismissed it as coincidence if she hadn't seen the same vehicle, same license plate, same position, on Thursday afternoon when she returned from the library, and again on Saturday when she took Emma for a walk in the stroller Grace had bought at a thrift store. The surveillance was professional enough to be subtle but obvious enough to send a message. They wanted her to know she was being watched, wanted her to feel the pressure of unseen eyes tracking her movements, and the knowledge made her skin crawl every time she left the garage apartment. The welfare caseworker, a tired woman named Linda Chen who'd been helping Sarah navigate the bureaucracy of public assistance, mentioned it almost casually during their weekly check-in at the county office, saying someone from corporate legal had called asking questions about Sarah's case, wanting to know about her employment history, her living situation, whether there were any concerns about her fitness as a mother. "I didn't tell them anything," Linda said, her expression troubled. "Client information is confidential, but they were very insistent, very official, and they knew things, knew you'd been staying at Street. Catherine's knew about the ID replacement, like they'd been tracking you somehow." Sarah felt ice spread through her veins, because if the Whitmores were reaching into county social services, if they had people monitoring her welfare applications and doctor visits for Emma, then nowhere was safe. No part of her life was beyond their reach. She told James about it that evening when he came to the garage apartment to review more of Daniel's research, and his face went pale in the lamplight. "This is how powerful families protect their interests," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They don't come at you directly. They don't make threats you can report to police. They squeeze, they pressure. They make your life impossible until you break. And Sarah, you need to understand. My Uncle Arthur didn't just die of a heart attack. I've never believed that. A 58-year-old marathon runner with perfect health doesn't just drop dead in his office the week before he's supposed to testify about evidence in a federal investigation." He pulled out his phone and showed her news articles about other whistleblowers, other people who'd tried to expose corporate corruption and ended up dead in car accidents, house fires, sudden illnesses that doctors couldn't explain, a litany of convenient tragedies that were never quite investigated thoroughly enough. "They killed your grandfather, they killed Daniel, they killed my uncle, and now you're the only one left who knows the truth and has the evidence to prove it. You need to be very, very careful." Grace, who'd been listening from the doorway, her face grave, didn't argue or try to minimize the danger. Instead, she spent the next day having a security system installed, cameras covering every angle of her property, motion sensors on the garage apartment door and windows, and she retrieved something from her bedroom that she showed Sarah with quiet determination: her late husband's shotgun, cleaned and loaded, and placed in a locked cabinet by her bed. "I failed my daughter," Grace said, her cheerful demeanor replaced by something harder, something forged in grief and regret. "I let fear and judgment push her away when she needed me most. I won't make that mistake again. You and Emma are under my protection now, and anyone who wants to hurt you will have to go through me first." That night, Sarah lay awake with Emma sleeping in the bassinet beside her bed, listening to every creak of the old garage, every rustle of wind against the windows, knowing that the black SUV was probably out there somewhere in the darkness, knowing that powerful people were making plans, and knowing that the walls were closing in. James arrived at Grace's garage apartment late at night with his own laptop, one he assured Sarah wasn't connected to his law firm's network and couldn't be traced, and together they plugged in the USB drive labeled insurance that Marcus Mitchell had left in the safety deposit box 15 years ago. The drive contained a single folder, meticulously organized into subfolders by year and category, representing what must have been thousands of hours of investigation. And as they began clicking through the files, Sarah realized she was looking at the most comprehensive documentation of corporate crime she could have imagined. The first folder, labeled Dumping Sites 2006 to 2008, contained hundreds of photographs, each one time-stamped and GPS tagged, showing Whitmore Industries trucks at remote locations throughout Montana, unloading barrels marked with hazardous waste symbols into unmarked pits that were hastily covered with dirt and gravel. Mitchell had been thorough, photographing license plates, driver faces, company logos, creating an irrefutable visual record of illegal activity that had been happening for years under the cover of darkness in places far from witnesses. The next folder contained soil and water test results from an independent laboratory, reports showing arsenic levels 40 times above safe limits, lead contamination that exceeded EPA standards by factors of hundreds, industrial solvents that caused cancer and birth defects seeping into groundwater that fed wells and streams for miles around. Each report was paired with official Whitmore Industries cleanup documents filed with the state environmental agency, showing the exact same sites tested and declared safe, the falsification so blatant it was almost insulting in its audacity. There were emails, recovered through methods Sarah didn't want to know about, between Whitmore executives discussing the cost-benefit analysis of proper waste disposal versus illegal dumping, with one particularly damning exchange where Richard Whitmore calculated that even if they were caught and fined, the penalties would be less than the cost of legal disposal, making pollution simply a smart business decision. James's hands were shaking as he opened the folder labeled Audio Evidence, and what they heard in those recordings made Sarah's blood run cold, because these weren't careful corporate discussions. These were casual conversations between people who believed they were above the law, beyond consequences. Richard Whitmore's voice, recorded at what sounded like a private dinner party, joking about creative accounting and managing environmental liabilities. A Whitmore Industries plant manager explaining to someone how they'd bribed county inspectors with cash payments and promises of jobs for family members. An environmental consultant who'd been hired to assess contamination, admitting on tape that his reports were written to Whitmore specifications rather than scientific reality, that he'd been paid $200,000 to make problems disappear on paper. But the final recording, time-stamped 2 days before Marcus Mitchell's death, was the one that changed everything, transformed the case from corporate malfeasance to murder conspiracy. Victoria Whitmore's voice was unmistakable, that cultured, cold tone Sarah had heard in person, discussing the Mitchell problem with someone whose voice was harder, rougher, clearly not part of the family's social circle. "He's meeting with federal investigators on Thursday," Victoria said, her words captured with crystal clarity. "He has evidence that could destroy everything we've built, everything this family has worked for. I don't care how you do it. I don't want details, but this problem needs to be handled permanently. Make it look like an accident, a heart attack, something natural. And make sure that lawyer Blackwell understands what happens to people who help Mitchell. I want this buried. I want him buried, and I want it done before Thursday." The other voice asked about money, and Victoria laughed, a sound devoid of humanity. "You'll have $500,000 in cash, untraceable, and a guarantee that you'll never work again because you'll be too rich to need to. Just handle this. And handle it permanently." The recording ended, and Sarah and James sat in stunned silence, because they were listening to a woman ordering the murder of her own father, ordering it as casually as she might order dinner, and they had it all on tape, dated, time-stamped, and preserved on a USB drive that Marcus Mitchell had left as insurance, as evidence, as his final act of defiance against the family that had chosen money over morality. Richard Whitmore arrived at Grace's house on a gray Thursday afternoon with a lawyer in tow, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit who carried a leather briefcase like it contained the solutions to all of life's problems. And Grace answered the door with her shotgun propped visibly against the wall behind her, making it clear this meeting would happen on her terms or not at all. Sarah came down from the garage apartment with Emma on her hip, her phone already recording in her jacket pocket, a trick James had taught her, and she stood in Grace's living room facing the man who'd thrown her into a blizzard with a newborn and felt nothing but cold contempt. Richard settled into Grace's worn armchair as though he owned it, his lawyer standing beside him like a sentinel, and when he spoke, his voice had that same smooth reasonableness he'd used before, the tone of a man making a generous offer to someone too stupid to appreciate it. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct because I respect your intelligence, even if you've made some very foolish choices lately," he said, opening the briefcase to reveal neat stacks of documents. "My family is prepared to offer you $5 million, cash, tax-free through a series of offshore accounts my attorney has already established. In exchange, you sign over any claim to the Mitchell estate, you agree to a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, and you disappear from our lives permanently. You take your daughter, you start over somewhere far from here, and everyone wins." Sarah felt Grace tense beside her, but she kept her voice level. "And if I refuse?" Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then you're making a terrible mistake. You're a 24-year-old girl with no education, no job prospects, no family, no resources. You're living in a garage apartment, surviving on welfare and the charity of strangers. Do you really think you can fight Whitmore Industries? Do you have any concept of the legal resources, the political connections, the sheer power we can bring to bear?" Sarah thought of Marcus Mitchell's evidence, of the recordings, of Daniel's research, and she squared her shoulders. "I know what you did to my grandfather. I know what you did to Daniel, and I know about Bitterroot Summit and why you need my land." The room went absolutely still, and Richard's mask of genteel civility cracked, revealing something cold and vicious underneath. "Daniel," he said, his voice dropping to something harder, "my son was always too soft, too curious, too concerned with right and wrong instead of understanding how the real world works. When he came to me with his discoveries, with his moral outrage about his grandfather's death and his mother's lies, I gave him a choice: forget what he'd learned, or face the consequences. He chose poorly." Sarah felt her heart hammering. "You killed your own son." "I protected my family's interests," Richard corrected, standing now, his tall frame suddenly menacing in Grace's small living room. "Daniel's death was unfortunate but necessary. He was going to destroy everything we'd built, cost us billions, send his mother to prison. Over what? Some environmental regulations. Some contaminated land in places nobody cares about. He couldn't see the bigger picture, couldn't understand that sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good of the family." The lawyer put a hand on Richard's arm, a warning, but Richard shook him off. "You think you're different. You think you're going to expose us, bring us down, but you're nothing. You have nothing. And if you try to use whatever you think you've found, you'll end up just like Daniel, just like Marcus Mitchell, just like anyone who's ever threatened Whitmore interests. Accidents happen, Sarah, especially to young mothers with infant daughters, especially to people who don't know when to accept a generous offer and walk away." He moved toward the door, his lawyer scrambling to follow, and his parting words echoed in the sudden silence. "You're playing a game you can't win, with stakes you don't understand. You have 48 hours to accept the $5 million. After that, the offer expires, and you become a problem that needs to be solved, permanently." That night, after Richard Whitmore's threats still hung in the air like poison, James arrived at Grace's garage apartment with someone Sarah hadn't met before. A woman in her late 30s with sharp, dark eyes, olive skin that spoke of long hours in the sun chasing stories, and the kind of intensity that suggested she'd seen things that would break lesser people and had chosen to document them instead. "Sarah, this is Elena Rodriguez," James said, and there was something different in his voice now, something harder, more determined, as though a mask he'd been wearing for weeks had finally been discarded. "She's an investigative journalist with the Montana Independent, and before you ask, yes, I've already told her everything, because it's time you both knew the truth about who I really am and why I've been helping you." He sat down at the small table where Sarah had spent so many nights reading Daniel's research, his hands clasped in front of him, and when he spoke, Sarah heard the pain beneath the professional composure, the grief that had been carefully contained but never resolved. "Arthur Blackwell wasn't just my boss. He was my uncle, my mother's brother. He raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, paid for my college and law school, taught me everything I know about the law and about standing up for what's right even when it costs you, and he was the best man I've ever known. The kind of lawyer who turned down million-dollar corporate clients to take pro bono cases for people who couldn't afford representation." James's voice cracked slightly, and Elena reached over to squeeze his shoulder in a gesture that spoke of shared understanding. 3 months before he died, Arthur told me he was working on the most important case of his career, something involving environmental crimes and a murdered whistleblower named Marcus Mitchell. He said he'd spent 2 years tracking down the primary beneficiary of Mitchell's estate. a young woman who'd been adopted after her father died and had grown up never knowing her real family history. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she'd married a man named Daniel Whitmore without knowing that his family had murdered her grandfather and stolen her inheritance. Sarah felt Grace's hand on her shoulder as James continued. Arthur said he'd finally made contact with Daniel, that Daniel had discovered the truth about his own family, and wanted to help. They were going to arrange a meeting to tell you everything, to give you the evidence, and help you claim what was rightfully yours. And then 1 week later, Daniel's car went off that bridge on a clear night with perfect road conditions, and 2 days after that, my uncle died at his desk, supposedly a heart attack, but Arthur ran marathons. He had the cardiovascular health of a man 20 years younger, and the autopsy was rushed, performed by a medical examiner who just happened to have received a substantial research grant from a Whitmore family foundation the previous year. The body was cremated within 48 hours before I could even think to ask for a second opinion, before anyone could question whether a healthy 58-year-old really just dropped dead from natural causes. Elena leaned forward, her journalist's notebook already open, filled with years of meticulous documentation. "I've been investigating Whitmore Industries for 6 years," she said, her voice carrying the weight of long frustration and hard-won determination. "I started when a source came to me with information about contaminated groundwater in a rural community. Children were getting sick, rare cancers in kids under 10, birth defects, neurological problems. And when I started digging, I found Whitmore Industries at the center of it all. They'd been dumping industrial waste illegally for decades, and the state environmental agency was either incompetent or complicit, probably both." She pulled out a thick folder, its edges worn from years of handling, and spread photographs across the table. Images of sick children, of poisoned wells, of communities destroyed by corporate greed. "I've documented 12 different contamination sites, interviewed hundreds of victims, people whose lives have been utterly destroyed by what Whitmore Industries did to their land, their water, their children. But every time I get close to publication, every time I think I have enough evidence to make the story bulletproof, something happens. Sources suddenly recant their statements. Documents disappear from supposedly secure locations. My editors get calls from Whitmore's legal team threatening defamation lawsuits that would bankrupt the paper and put everyone out of work. They're very good at making problems disappear." Elena's expression hardened. "I've had my car broken into 4 times, always when I was away from it for just a few minutes. Nothing stolen but my notebooks, my backup drives, anything related to the Whitmore investigation. My apartment has been ransacked twice. Professional jobs, no fingerprints, no witnesses. Just a clear message that I was being watched. And last year, I was driving on Highway 93 through the mountains when a truck forced me off the road. I ended up in a ditch with a concussion and 3 broken ribs. The truck never stopped, and the police investigation went nowhere because there were no cameras, no witnesses, just me and my word against nothing." She paused, meeting Sarah's eyes with fierce determination. "When James contacted me 2 days ago and told me about the USB drive, about Marcus Mitchell's recordings, about the evidence that's been hidden for 15 years, I knew this was what I've been waiting for. This is the story that's going to bring them down. Evidence so comprehensive, so damning, that not even Whitmore's army of lawyers can make it disappear or threaten it away." James took Sarah's hand across the table. "We want to go public with everything. All of Marcus Mitchell's evidence, all of Daniel's research, the recordings of Victoria ordering your grandfather's murder, the documents showing the contamination and the cover-up, everything. But we have to do it strategically. We need to coordinate with federal investigators so the Whitmores can't destroy evidence or flee the country. And most importantly, we need to get you and Emma somewhere safe before we publish. Because once this story breaks, you become the star witness in what will probably be the biggest corporate crime case Montana has seen in decades. And the Whitmores will do absolutely anything to silence you." Sarah looked around the small garage apartment, at Elena with her folders of suffering and determination, at James with his grief and his need for justice, at Grace who stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the expression of a woman who'd lost one daughter and wouldn't lose another. And she thought about Daniel, about the grandfather she'd never met who died trying to do the right thing, about all the families poisoned by Whitmore Industries' greed, and she thought about Emma sleeping peacefully in her bassinet, about the world her daughter would inherit, about whether it would be one where justice existed or one where the powerful always won simply because no one had the courage to stand against them? "What do we do first?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear, and Elena's smile was fierce and triumphant. "First, we make copies of everything and hide them in multiple secure locations. Then we contact FBI agent Robert Morrison. He's been building a RICO case against Whitmore Industries for 3 years, but hasn't had enough evidence for an indictment. With what you have, he can move tomorrow. And then, we write the story that's going to change everything." Sarah was at the public library with Emma the following Tuesday afternoon, the baby sleeping in her stroller while Sarah used one of the computer terminals to help Elena compile a comprehensive timeline of Whitmore Industries' environmental violations, cross-referencing Marcus Mitchell's evidence with Elena's own 6 years of investigation, when her phone buzzed with Grace's number, and the older woman's voice came through, shaking with adrenaline rather than fear. "They came, Sarah. Men broke into your apartment. They tore the place apart looking for something. But don't worry, I sent them running with their tails between their legs. You should have seen how fast they moved when I fired that warning shot." Sarah's blood turned to ice, and she was gathering Emma and her belongings before Grace had finished the sentence. Out the library door and running for the bus stop, her heart hammering against her ribs as terrible scenarios played through her mind. Grace hurt, the apartment destroyed, the evidence stolen, everything they'd worked for gone in a single violent moment. The bus ride across town felt like it took hours instead of 20 minutes, and when Sarah finally arrived at Grace's house, she found 2 police cruisers in the driveway, their lights painting the quiet residential street in alternating red and blue, and Grace sitting on her porch steps with a gray wool blanket draped around her shoulders despite the mild spring afternoon, the shotgun propped against the railing beside her like a faithful guardian. The garage apartment looked like a hurricane had torn through it with malicious intent, the mattress slashed open with its cheap foam stuffing pulled out in chunks and scattered across the floor, the floorboards pried up with a crowbar that had been left abandoned in the corner. Sarah's few belongings, her clothes, Emma's diapers and bottles, Daniel's papers, everything scattered and torn apart in a desperate search for something these intruders hadn't found. The small kitchenette's cabinets hung open, their meager contents dumped on the counter. The bathroom medicine cabinet had been torn completely off the wall, and even Emma's bassinet had been overturned, its thin mattress sliced open as though documents might be hidden inside. Officer Maria Ramirez, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, gray-streaked dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen too much human ugliness to be shocked by anything, took Sarah's statement while her partner, a younger man named Officer Peterson, methodically photographed the damage with a department-issued camera. "Mrs. Morrison says she heard unusual noises coming from the garage around 2 p.m., came to investigate thinking maybe a raccoon had gotten in, and found 2 men, both wearing dark clothing, black jeans, black jackets, black ski masks, ransacking your apartment," Officer Ramirez said, reading from her notes. When she challenged them and demanded to know what they were doing, they ignored her completely, continued searching. So she retrieved her shotgun from her bedroom, returned, gave them a verbal warning, and when they still didn't leave, she fired a single warning shot into the ceiling, at which point they immediately fled, ran to a black SUV that had been parked on the next block over, and were gone before Mrs. Morrison could get a license plate number. Grace, still wrapped in her blanket despite the afternoon warmth, her hands steady but her voice still carrying the tremor of post-adrenaline crash, added details the police report wouldn't capture. They were professionals, Sarah, not common thieves looking for jewelry or electronics. They didn't take the laptop that was sitting right there on the table in plain sight. Didn't take the $40 in cash I keep in my kitchen drawer for emergencies. They were looking for something very specific, and when I confronted them, before I went to get the gun, one of them, the bigger one, well over 6 feet and built like a linebacker, he looked me right in the eye and said in this cold, flat voice, "The documents, the old man's documents. Where did she hide them?" And that's when I knew these weren't random burglars. These were people sent by someone who knew exactly what they wanted. Sarah felt her stomach drop, because only the Whitmores knew about Marcus Mitchell's evidence. Only they would send people looking for the old man's documents, and the fact that they'd escalated from surveillance and threats to an actual break-in, to sending men into Grace's home in broad daylight, meant that Richard Whitmore's 48-hour deadline was more than just intimidation. It was a promise of escalating violence. Officer Peterson returned from checking the property perimeter, his young face troubled. No shell casings outside, no fingerprints on the doorknob or anywhere else. They wore gloves and knew what they were doing. Picked the lock cleanly without damaging it. Very professional entry. And the SUV, according to Mr. Henderson 3 houses down who got a partial plate, comes back to a vehicle registered to Premier Security Solutions, which is a private security and private investigation firm that services corporate clients. But without a full plate number or proof of who specifically was driving it, we've got a dead end unless we can get a warrant for their rental records, which we won't get without more evidence than we currently have. Sarah pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called James, who arrived 30 minutes later with Elena, both of them having been at the Montana Independence offices working on the story. And together they explained to Officer Ramirez, carefully choosing their words to avoid mentioning federal investigations or murder conspiracies that would sound insane without context, that Sarah was involved in a civil dispute with her late husband's wealthy family over a substantial inheritance, and she had reason to believe the Whitmores were trying to intimidate her into signing away her legal rights. Ramirez's expression suggested she suspected there was significantly more to the story than they were sharing, her experienced cop's intuition reading the fear and tension in the room. But she dutifully filed a report for breaking and entering, criminal trespass, and vandalism, though she warned that without being able to identify the specific perpetrators or prove definitively who had sent them, there was very little the police could actually do beyond increasing patrols in the neighborhood and documenting the incident for potential future legal action. After the officers left, their cruisers pulling away and taking with them the illusion of immediate safety, Sarah sat on the destroyed mattress surrounded by the wreckage of her tiny life and felt the weight of everything crushing down on her. Because the break-in meant the Whitmores were getting desperate, meant they knew she had evidence somewhere, meant they were willing to escalate to violence and home invasion, and that Grace had only barely avoided serious harm. "Where are the documents?" Grace asked quietly, her hand resting on Sarah's shoulder, and Sarah managed a weak smile despite the fear. "Exactly where you told me to put them 3 days ago when we made the backup plan. In a safety deposit box at Mountain States Bank on the other side of town, under the name Sarah Mitchell instead of Sarah Whitmore, with James listed as the only other person with access rights. They can tear this place apart 100 times, tear apart my whole life, and they'll never find what they're looking for, because it's not here." Elena was already on her phone, pacing the small space while she spoke in rapid, urgent tones. "This break-in changes everything, changes our entire timeline. We need to move much faster than we planned. I'm calling Agent Morrison tonight, instead of waiting until Friday. And Sarah, you and Emma absolutely cannot stay here anymore. It's not safe. The Whitmores just showed they're willing to come directly at you in your home, willing to terrorize an elderly woman, and next time they might not run when Grace fires a warning shot." Elena spread a large topographical map across Grace's dining room table the next morning, a map she'd been building for 6 years, marked with dozens of colored pins representing contamination sites, cancer diagnoses, birth defects, and unexplained deaths, and as Sarah studied the pattern, her breath caught because what had seemed like isolated incidents in Elena's individual folders became something far more sinister when viewed as a whole. 3 counties, Elena said, her finger tracing the spread of pins across the map: Ravalli, Missoula, and Granite counties, covering approximately 4,000 square miles. And every single contamination site, every single cancer cluster, every single poisoned well traces back to Whitmore Industries, either directly or through their shell companies. She pulled out a thick binder, one of dozens she'd compiled. This one labeled Medical Records, Clearwater Valley, and inside were photocopied hospital records, death certificates, and testimonies from families whose lives had been destroyed by invisible poison. Clearwater Valley is a rural community of about 800 people, mostly working-class families, some farmers, some loggers, people who've lived there for generations. And starting in 2009, they began seeing cases of childhood leukemia. 3 cases in a community that size should be statistically impossible. Then in 2011, a cluster of rare thyroid cancers in adults under 40, then birth defects, then neurological disorders. By 2015, the community had a cancer rate 300% higher than the national average. Sarah looked at the photographs Elena had included, pictures of children with no hair from chemotherapy, of mothers holding babies born with devastating birth defects, of gravestones marking lives cut impossibly short. and she felt rage building in her chest, a white-hot fury at the Whitmores who'd done this knowingly, deliberately, for profit. The State Environmental Agency tested the water in 2016, Elena continued, pulling out official reports, and found elevated levels of trichloroethylene, benzene, and heavy metals, all industrial chemicals, all carcinogenic, all in concentrations high enough to cause serious health effects. But when they tried to identify the source, Whitmore Industries lawyers blocked the investigation, claimed trade secret protections, threatened lawsuits, and the state backed down because they didn't have the resources to fight a corporation with unlimited legal funding. James, who'd been studying Marcus Mitchell's geological surveys from the safety deposit box, suddenly looked up with an expression of dawning horror. "The aquifer," he said, spreading Mitchell's maps beside Elena's. "Look at the aquifer system. Clearwater Valley and 11 other communities all draw their water from the Bitterroot Aquifer, a massive underground water system that covers all 3 counties, and Mitchell's surveys show exactly where the contamination entered the system. Here, at the old Whitmore Industries chemical processing plant that operated from 1985 to 2003, they were dumping waste directly into unlined pits that sat right above the aquifer's primary recharge zone. Everything they dumped went straight into the groundwater, and it's been spreading through the aquifer for over 20 years, poisoning every well, every stream, every source of water for hundreds of miles." Elena nodded grimly. "I've been trying to prove that connection for 3 years, but I needed geological evidence, needed to show the contamination pathway, needed expert testimony about how aquifers work and how pollutants spread through them. And I didn't have it because the only comprehensive geological survey of this region was done by Marcus Mitchell in the 1990 seconds. And after he died, all his research disappeared. His daughter Catherine supposedly destroyed it." Sarah felt the pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. "But he didn't destroy it. He put it in the safety deposit box. He knew this evidence would be needed, knew that someday someone would have to prove what Whitmore Industries had done." James pulled out another document from Mitchell's collection, this one a detailed geological report with core samples and water flow analysis. Mitchell didn't just document what happened, he predicted what would happen. Look at this projection from 2008. He calculated that if the contamination wasn't remediated immediately, if the source wasn't cleaned up and contained, the toxic plume would spread through the entire aquifer system within 15 years, would affect approximately 50,000 people across 3 counties, would cause thousands of cancers, would essentially poison an entire region's water supply for generations. And he took this report to Whitmore Industries, to his own daughter and son-in-law, and begged them to do the right thing, to clean it up before more people died, and they ignored him, threatened him, and eventually killed him to keep him quiet. Grace, who'd been listening from the kitchen doorway, spoke quietly. "And the Bitterroot Summit development, that's not really about building luxury homes, is it?" Elena shook her head. "The development is cover. It's the most elaborate evidence destruction scheme I've ever seen. Look at the site plans. They're proposing to excavate and grade the entire area where the original contamination occurred. They'll dig up thousands of tons of poisoned soil, claim they're preparing the site for construction, and legally dispose of it as construction debris rather than hazardous waste, saving hundreds of millions in cleanup costs. Then they'll pour millions of cubic yards of concrete for roads, foundations, infrastructure, literally burying the crime scene under a small city. And once it's developed, once there are homes and businesses and people living there, no one will ever be able to prove what was underneath. The evidence will be gone forever, entombed under concrete and asphalt and the weight of normal life." Sarah looked at the map, at the pins marking suffering and death, at Marcus Mitchell's surveys showing the poison spreading through the earth like cancer through a body. And she understood why the Whitmores were so desperate, why they'd killed her grandfather and Daniel and Arthur Blackwell, because this wasn't just corporate malfeasance, this was mass poisoning. This was thousands of victims. This was the kind of crime that would send everyone involved to prison for the rest of their lives and bankrupt the company in wrongful death lawsuits. And the only way to escape it was to bury the evidence so deep it could never be found. And the only thing standing in their way was Sarah and the inheritance she didn't even know she had until 2 months ago. James called Sarah on Thursday evening, his voice crackling with excitement over the phone connection, saying he'd finally found it, the proof they needed to connect the Whitmores directly to Daniel's death. He'd been going through accident investigation records at the county clerk's office and had discovered discrepancies in the brake line failure report, photographs that showed clean cuts rather than wear pattern brakes, and he had the name of the mechanic who'd been paid to falsify the inspection report, a man named Derek Simmons who worked at a garage that contracted with Whitmore Industries for their fleet maintenance. I'm going to interview him tomorrow morning. James said. He's agreed to talk, to give a statement. He's scared, but he's dying of liver cancer and wants to clear his conscience before he goes. Sarah, this is it. This is the evidence that proves Daniel was murdered. I'll call you as soon as I have the statement recorded. But James never called the next morning, and when Sarah tried his cell phone repeatedly, it went straight to voicemail. The generic automated message suggesting the phone was either off or out of service range, which was unusual because James was meticulous about staying reachable. Always kept his phone charged, always responded to messages within minutes. By noon, Sarah was worried enough to call Elena, who drove to James's apartment building in downtown Missoula, a modest complex where young professionals lived in small one-bedroom units, and what she found there made her immediately call Sarah with a voice tight with barely controlled panic. His apartment is empty, Elena said. Not just empty like he moved out, but cleaned, professionally cleaned. There's no furniture, no clothes, no books, nothing. The landlord says men came this morning with a moving truck, said they were hired by the tenant to clear out the apartment because of a family emergency. They had keys, had James's signature on a work order. The landlord had no reason to question it, but Sarah, the apartment smells like industrial cleaning solution. They didn't just move his stuff, they sterilized the place. This is what professionals do when they're eliminating evidence. Sarah felt ice spreading through her veins as Elena continued. I called James's office at Blackwell and Associates. They said he called in sick yesterday, said he'd be out for a few days, but I know James. I've worked with him for 2 weeks now. He would never call in sick when we're this close to publishing. Something's wrong. Something's very wrong. And I think the Whitmores have him. That afternoon, while Sarah was trying to decide whether to call the police or Agent Morrison or both, a package arrived at Elena's home, delivered by a professional courier service that had been paid in cash and had no record of who'd sent it, and inside the nondescript brown box was a manila envelope containing photographs, dozens of them, all taken in the past week, showing Elena's daughter Maria, a bright-eyed 8-year-old girl with her mother's dark hair and her father's gentle smile. The photos showed Maria walking to school, playing on the playground during recess, eating lunch in the cafeteria with her friends, and most chillingly, standing alone waiting for the bus on a street corner. Vulnerable and unprotected, and tucked among the photographs was a single typed note on plain white paper. Your daughter is beautiful. Such a tragedy if something were to happen to her. Accidents happen to children all the time, especially when their mothers don't know when to stop asking questions. You have 24 hours to destroy all evidence and kill the story. If we see any publication, if you contact authorities, if you do anything except back off immediately, Maria will disappear just like James Chen. We know where she goes to school. We know her route home. We know she takes dance class on Tuesdays and has a piano lesson on Thursdays. We know everything, and we're watching. Elena showed up at Grace's house 2 hours later, her face pale and her hands shaking. The photograph spread across the dining room table like evidence of her worst nightmare made real, and Sarah looked at the images of this innocent child. This little girl whose only crime was having a mother brave enough to pursue the truth, and felt the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her shoulders. I can't do it, Elena said, tears streaming down her face. I can't risk Maria. She's everything to me. My ex-husband already has a lawyer trying to get full custody because of the dangerous situations my job puts me in. If anything happens to her, if they so much as touch her, I'll never forgive myself. The story isn't worth my daughter's life. Nothing is worth that. Grace wrapped her arms around Elena while Sarah stood at the window, looking out at the spring afternoon, thinking about James who was somewhere scared or hurt or worse, thinking about Elena's daughter who was being stalked by monsters in human clothing, thinking about Emma asleep in her bassinet, thinking about all the children poisoned by Whitmore Industries' contaminated water, the ones who died and the ones still dying. And she realized with terrible clarity that this was exactly what the Whitmores wanted. They wanted her to feel responsible, wanted her to carry the weight of other people's safety, wanted her to break under the impossible burden of choosing between justice and protecting the people she'd come to love. Richard Whitmore's words echoed in her mind. You're playing a game you can't win, with stakes you don't understand. And Sarah understood now that the stakes weren't money or property or even her own life. The stakes were whether she could live with herself if she surrendered. If she let her grandfather's murder go unavenged, let Daniel's death be in vain, let the Whitmores bury their crimes and continue poisoning communities for profit, or whether she could live with herself if her refusal to surrender got James killed, got Maria hurt, got everyone she cared about destroyed by a family that had demonstrated they would stop at absolutely nothing to protect their empire of poison and lies. Sarah made the decision at 3 a.m, lying awake in the garage apartment with Emma sleeping beside her, and the weight of impossible choices pressing on her chest until she could barely breathe. And when the first light of dawn crept through the window, she was already dressed and dialing the number Elena had given her weeks ago. The direct line to the FBI field office in Missoula that Elena had said was their last resort if everything went wrong, and everything had gone very, very wrong. The receptionist who answered at 7 a.m. sharp transferred her to a senior agent after Sarah said the words Whitmore Industries and Marcus Mitchell, and 15 minutes later, she was sitting in Grace's kitchen with her phone on speaker while a man with a deep, calm voice introduced himself as Special Agent Robert Morrison, Organized Crime Division, and asked her to explain very carefully why she was calling. Sarah told him everything: the safety deposit box, the inheritance, the evidence of contamination and murder, Daniel's death, Arthur Blackwell's death, and finally, voice-breaking, James's disappearance and the photographs of Elena's daughter. And when she finished, there was a long silence before Agent Morrison spoke again, his voice carrying an intensity that hadn't been there before. "Miss Mitchell, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not go anywhere. Do not speak to anyone else about this. I'm coming to you personally with a team. I'll be there in 45 minutes, and until I arrive, you need to stay inside with your doors locked and your phone in your hand. Do you understand?" Sarah felt hope and terror warring in her chest as she agreed, and exactly 45 minutes later, 3 black SUVs pulled up to Grace's house, and Agent Morrison stepped out of the lead vehicle. A tall African-American man in his early 50s with gray at his temples, sharp, intelligent eyes, and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades staring down criminals and refusing to blink. He came into Grace's dining room with 2 other agents, a woman named Chen and a younger man named Torres, and he looked at the evidence Sarah had laid out on the table: Marcus Mitchell's documents, the USB drive, the recordings, Daniel's research, and his expression shifted from professional interest to something closer to awe. "We've been building a RICO case against Whitmore Industries for 3 years, Morrison said, sitting down heavily in one of Grace's chairs. "Racketeering, environmental crimes, bribery of public officials, witness tampering. We've had suspicions about murders but no proof, no evidence that would hold up in court, and the Whitmores have the best lawyers money can buy. They've blocked us at every turn, gotten evidence suppressed, intimidated witnesses. We've been fighting an uphill battle with one hand tied behind our backs." He looked at Sarah with something like respect in his eyes. "Your grandfather, Marcus Mitchell, he was our confidential informant. He came to us in 2008 with preliminary evidence, agreed to work with us to build a comprehensive case. He was meticulous, careful, exactly the kind of witness we needed. But the day before he was supposed to give his formal statement, the day before we were going to put him in protective custody, he died. Supposedly natural causes, and without his testimony, without his evidence, the case fell apart. We've been trying to rebuild it ever since, but we've never had anything close to what you're showing me right now." Agent Chen was already photographing the documents while Torres set up recording equipment. "This USB drive," Morrison said, holding it like it was made of gold. "This recording of Victoria Whitmore ordering your grandfather's murder, this alone is enough for conspiracy charges. But combined with the environmental evidence, the falsified reports, the shell company documentation, this is everything we need to bring down the entire organization, to file RICO charges against not just the Whitmores but everyone in the company who participated in the conspiracy. We're talking about dozens of arrests, asset seizures, the complete dismantling of Whitmore Industries." Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay focused, to negotiate from the only position of power she had. "I'll give you everything," she said, her voice steady despite the fear. "I'll testify. I'll be your witness. I'll do whatever you need, but I have conditions. You find James Chen. You protect Elena Rodriguez and her daughter Maria. You protect Grace Morrison, and you protect my daughter Emma. I want them in protective custody starting today, right now. I want federal marshals. I want safe houses. I want a guarantee that the Whitmores can't touch them. Because if you can't promise me that, if you can't keep the people I love safe, then I'll destroy this evidence and disappear. I'll take Emma and vanish, and you'll never see me or these documents again. Morrison studied her for a long moment, and Sarah could see him calculating, weighing the value of the evidence against the cost of the protection she demanded, but finally he nodded. You have my word. We'll put your daughter Grace and Elena's daughter in protective custody within 2 hours. We'll assign a team to find James Chen, and we'll have agents outside Elena's house and her daughter's school within 30 minutes. But Sarah, you need to understand what you're agreeing to. Testifying against the Whitmores means your life changes permanently. You'll be the key witness in one of the biggest corporate crime trials in Montana history. You'll be on the stand for days, maybe weeks. The Whitmore defense team will attack your credibility, your character, everything about you. And even with protection, there's risk. These people have already killed multiple times. They have resources we can only guess at. I can promise you the best protection the Bureau can provide, but I can't promise you'll be completely safe. Sarah looked at Emma sleeping in her bassinet, at Grace standing protectively in the doorway, at the evidence spread across the table representing 15 years of hidden crimes and countless victims. And she thought about her grandfather Marcus Mitchell, who died trying to do the right thing, about Daniel, who died discovering the truth, about James, who was missing because he tried to help her. And she realized that safety had always been an illusion, that the Whitmores had already taken everything from her except her daughter and her conscience, and she'd be damned if she let them take those too. Agent Morrison moved with the kind of focused intensity that came from decades of experience, making calls on his encrypted phone while his team set up a command center in Grace's living room, and within an hour, they had a lead on James's location, traced through the cell phone ping from his last call to Sarah, combined with surveillance footage from traffic cameras showing a black SUV matching the description from the break-in, heading toward the industrial district on the outskirts of town. Whitmore Industries owns a warehouse complex out there, Morrison explained, pointing to a map on his laptop. Officially, it's storage for construction equipment and supplies for the Bitterroot Summit project. But we've suspected for years it's also where they conduct their less legal operations. We've never had enough probable cause for a warrant, but a kidnapping victim being held there changes everything. Sarah watched from Grace's kitchen as the FBI mobilized, agents arriving in unmarked vehicles, tactical teams gearing up with body armor and weapons. The quiet residential street transformed into a staging area for a federal operation, and Morrison, seeing her pale face, explained that they were going in heavy, because Premier Security Solutions, the contractors who'd broken into the apartment, were ex-military, highly trained, and potentially armed. This wasn't a simple arrest. This was a hostage rescue. The raid happened at noon, coordinated with military precision. 3 teams hitting the warehouse simultaneously from different entry points, while a helicopter provided aerial surveillance. And Sarah listened to the radio chatter in Morrison's SUV where she sat with Agent Chen, who'd been assigned as her personal protection, hearing the terse, coded communications as the tactical team breached the building, cleared rooms, encountered resistance from 2 armed guards who surrendered immediately when confronted with overwhelming federal force. And then the words that made Sarah's heart leap. We've got him, victim located, he's alive. Requesting medical immediately. James was brought out on a stretcher 20 minutes later, conscious but clearly in bad shape, his face bruised and swollen, his left arm in an improvised sling, his clothes torn and stained, and he was clutching a manila folder against his chest with his good hand, refusing to let the paramedics take it even as they tried to start an IV and assess his injuries. Sarah was out of the SUV before Chen could stop her, running across the parking lot to where the ambulance was parked, and James's eyes found her through the pain and exhaustion. His voice hoarse but urgent as he said, I got it, Sarah. I got the proof before they grabbed me. It's all here. Don't let them take it. Morrison gently took the folder from James's grip, promising him it would be safe, it would be evidence. And as the ambulance doors closed and James was rushed to the hospital, Morrison opened the folder and Sarah saw what her friend had risked everything to preserve. It was Daniel's original accident investigation report, the real one, not the sanitized version that had been filed with the county, and the difference was damning. The official report, the one that had been made public, attributed Daniel's death to brake failure caused by normal wear and tear, a tragic accident on a dangerous mountain road. But this original report, stamped preliminary, not for distribution, and dated 2 days after the crash, told a completely different story. The investigating officer, a deputy named Martinez, who'd since retired and moved out of state, had documented clear evidence of tampering. The brake lines had been partially cut, not enough to fail immediately, but enough to fail under stress, under the kind of heavy braking you'd use on a steep mountain descent. And there were photographs, close-up shots showing the clean edges of the cuts, the deliberate scoring that would weaken the lines, and Martinez had noted in his report, brake line damage, inconsistent with wear or road debris. Pattern suggests intentional sabotage. Recommend criminal investigation. But that recommendation had never been followed, and 2 days later, a revised report had been filed. This time by a different investigator, a senior detective named Warren, who happened to be Richard Whitmore's brother-in-law. And that revised report had eliminated all mention of tampering, attributed the brake failure to age-related deterioration of rubber components, and closed the case as accidental death. James found Deputy Martinez, Agent Chen explained, having retrieved James's notes from his jacket pocket. Martinez lives in Arizona now, been retired for 5 years, and he kept a copy of his original report because he knew it was being covered up, knew someone had pressured his department to bury the evidence. He's agreed to testify, to explain how he was ordered to stand down from the investigation, how Detective Warren took over and rewrote everything. James was going to bring this to us yesterday, was on his way to the field office when he was grabbed outside his apartment. Morrison was already on the phone with the tactical team still searching the warehouse. Find everything, every document, every computer, every piece of paper. This is now a crime scene for kidnapping, conspiracy, and murder. I want this place torn apart. An agent called from inside the building, his voice excited over the radio. Sir, you need to see this. We've got a room full of files. Looks like financial records, communications. There's a safe we're cracking open now. What they found in that safe would later be described by prosecutors as the Rosetta Stone of the case. Spreadsheets detailing payoffs to public officials, communications between Victoria Whitmore and the security contractors discussing permanent solutions to various problems, including explicit references to Marcus Mitchell and Arthur Blackwell, and most incredibly, a ledger showing payments to Detective Warren for consultation services starting 1 week after Daniel's death. $500,000 paid over 6 months to the man who'd covered up the murder investigation. Sarah stood in the parking lot as agents carried box after box of evidence out of the warehouse, as the 2 security contractors were led out in handcuffs, and she realized that James's desperate gamble, his refusal to give up the folder even while being held captive, had given them everything they needed, the proof of Daniel's murder, the proof of the cover-up, and the connections that would bring criminal charges not just against the Whitmores, but against everyone who'd helped them kill and lie and poison their way to billions of dollars. The arrest happened at dawn 3 days later, coordinated to ensure maximum media coverage and minimum opportunity for the Whitmores to destroy evidence or flee. And Agent Morrison had invited Sarah to witness it from one of the FBI vehicles parked down the street from the Whitmore mansion, the same mansion where she'd been thrown out into a blizzard with a newborn baby. Sarah sat in the back of Morrison's SUV with Emma in her arms, watching as a convoy of federal vehicles rolled up the circular driveway. As agents in windbreakers emblazoned with FBI positioned themselves at every exit, and as Morrison himself walked up to the massive oak door with a warrant in his hand, the butler who'd thrown Sarah's belongings into the snow opened the door, his expression of disdain crumbling when Morrison announced federal warrants for Victoria and Richard Whitmore on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, environmental crimes, and witness tampering. By the time Victoria and Richard were let out in handcuffs, news vans had arrived, cameras rolling, reporters shouting questions, and Sarah watched through the tinted window as her former in-laws were brought down their own front steps. Victoria was dressed in an elegant robe, her silver hair disheveled, her face twisted with rage, while Richard looked diminished, the confident patriarch reduced to just another criminal being perp-walked for the cameras. Victoria was screaming at the agents, insisting this was a misunderstanding, that she had powerful friends, but Morrison's face was impassive, and it was then that Victoria saw Sarah sitting in the SUV with Emma, and something inside her snapped. She lunged toward Sarah's vehicle with such force that 2 agents had to restrain her, her voice rising to a shriek. This is your fault. You destroyed my family. You were nothing. Daniel married beneath him. You'll never be anything but a charity case, a worthless girl who got lucky. You don't deserve that money. You're nobody. Sarah stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward Victoria with Emma in her arms, her voice calm and clear, carrying to the cameras and reporters. You're right about one thing. I was nobody when you threw me out. I had nothing. But you made a mistake. You assumed that meant I couldn't fight back. But I found the truth you'd been hiding for 15 years. I found the evidence my grandfather died protecting, and I made sure the world would know what you did. She held Emma tighter. My grandfather, Marcus Mitchell, was somebody. My husband, Daniel, was somebody. And all the people you poisoned, all the children who died from your contaminated water, they were all somebody. And you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison, remembering that the nobody you threw away was the one who brought you down. Victoria let out a scream of rage as the agents got her into the vehicle. And then they were gone, heading to the federal courthouse, and Sarah stood in the driveway feeling nothing but profound completion, of justice delayed but not denied. The trial began 6 months later in federal court, and it became a national sensation, with news crews from every major network camped outside the courthouse, legal analysts dissecting every moment of testimony, and the hashtag number Whitmore Justice trending for weeks as the evidence of corporate corruption and murder was laid bare for the world to see. Sarah took the stand on the third day, wearing a simple navy dress that Grace had helped her pick out, her hands trembling as she placed them on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. And for 4 hours, she testified about Daniel's love, about his discovery of the conspiracy, about the night the Whitmores threw her into the blizzard, about finding the safety deposit box and her grandfather's letter, and about Richard Whitmore's confession in Grace's living room, which she'd recorded on her phone, the audio playing for the hushed courtroom as Richard's voice admitted that Daniel's death had been unfortunate but necessary. The Whitmores' defense team, a group of expensive lawyers in tailored suits, tried to discredit her, suggesting she was an opportunist who'd married Daniel for money, that she'd fabricated evidence out of grief and desperation. But their attacks fell apart when the prosecution played Marcus Mitchell's USB recordings, Victoria's voice captured with perfect clarity ordering her father's murder, discussing payoffs and cover-ups with the casual tone of someone ordering lunch, and the jury's faces showed shock and disgust as they listened to a daughter plot her own father's death for profit. Elena testified about her 6 years of investigation, about the cancer clusters and poisoned wells, about the intimidation and the photographs of her daughter, and James, still recovering from his injuries, testified about finding Deputy Martinez's original accident report, about being kidnapped and held in the warehouse, about the security contractors who'd told him he'd end up like Daniel Whitmore if he didn't forget what he'd learned. The trial lasted 8 weeks, and the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus Mitchell's geological surveys proving the contamination originated from Whitmore sites, the falsified environmental reports, the shell company documents, the payments to corrupt officials, the ledger showing Detective Warren's payoffs, and most damning, the recordings that captured the Whitmores discussing their crimes with the casual arrogance of people who'd never believed they'd face consequences. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning with their verdict, and Sarah sat in the courtroom with Emma on her lap, Grace on one side, and Elena on the other, as the foreperson stood and read, "Guilty on all counts, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, environmental crimes, witness tampering, obstruction of justice," a litany of convictions that would ensure Victoria and Richard Whitmore would spend the rest of their lives in prison. The sentencing came 2 weeks later. Victoria received 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Richard received 30 years, and the judge, a stern woman named Martinez, who'd heard every moment of testimony, said before pronouncing sentence, "You were given wealth, power, and privilege, and you used it not to build or create or help, but to poison, to kill, and to corrupt. You destroyed communities, murdered those who threatened to expose you, and showed not one moment of remorse. These sentences reflect the magnitude of your crimes and ensure you'll never harm anyone again." Whitmore Industries collapsed within months, its assets seized to fund victim compensation and environmental remediation. The Bitterroot Summit development was permanently halted, and the contaminated sites began the long process of cleanup that would take decades and cost hundreds of millions, but would finally begin to heal the land and water that had been poisoned for profit. 6 months after the sentencing, Sarah stood in a law office as Patricia Brennan, the court-appointed estate administrator, slid papers across the conference table with a smile. Miss Mitchell, the Marcus Mitchell estate has been fully settled, all claims resolved, inheritance tax paid, the assets are now officially yours, $95 million. Sarah looked at the documents and thought about the young woman who'd stood on a frozen driveway with nothing but $37 and a baby, and she felt not triumph but responsibility, because this money was a weapon her grandfather had left her to continue his fight. Within a week, working with James, who'd quit his paralegal position to help her, Sarah established the Daniel Whitmore Memorial Foundation, dedicated to environmental protection and justice for pollution victims. And the foundation's first act was donating Marcus Mitchell's 18 land parcels, worth $42 million, as a permanent nature preserve that would never be contaminated or exploited. The foundation used $30 million to fund environmental cleanup in the 3 poisoned counties, hiring scientists and specialists to purify water and treat soil, and another $20 million for legal aid, providing free representation to families affected by corporate pollution. James became the foundation's executive director, and within months they'd filed lawsuits against 12 other corporations whose environmental crimes had been covered up. Elena won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting for her series on Whitmore Industries, and in her acceptance speech, she thanked Sarah for having the courage to come forward, and for proving that one person with determination could bring down an empire of lies. Sarah attended with Emma, now 14 months old, watching her daughter play with Elena's medal and thinking about the world Emma would inherit, a world perhaps a little more just because people had chosen to fight rather than surrender. On a sunny spring morning, Sarah stood on the porch of her new home, a comfortable house with a yard where Emma could play safely. Grace lived in the guest house, finally able to retire comfortably, and Sarah wore a professional suit, heading to a foundation board meeting where they'd discuss expanding their legal aid program. She was no longer the frightened girl in the orange puffer jacket who'd felt worthless and disposable. She'd found her strength through the trial, her voice through testimony, and her purpose through the foundation that bore Daniel's name. Emma, now 14 months old, toddled around in pink overalls, her bright eyes and infectious laugh a daily reminder of why Sarah had fought so hard, why she'd refused to surrender even when the Whitmores had threatened everything she loved. Sarah scooped her daughter up and carried her to the car, buckling her carefully into the car seat, and as she started the engine, she looked at Emma in the rearview mirror and whispered words she said every morning. "Your daddy and great-grandpa would be proud, sweetheart. They fought for what was right, and we didn't let the bad people win. We told their story. We made sure everyone knew the truth." The story Marcus Mitchell had started with his whistleblowing, the story Daniel had tried to continue when he discovered his family's crimes, the story the Whitmores had tried to bury under threats and murder, that story had finally been told, and justice, though it had taken 15 years and cost precious lives, had finally prevailed. Sarah pulled out of her driveway, heading toward the foundation offices, and she realized that her inheritance wasn't really the $95 million, it was something more valuable. The knowledge that even the powerless could fight back, that truth was stronger than lies, and that one person with courage could change the world.